Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Hi, today I'd like to talk just briefly about Pontius Pilate. I was reminded of this actually because I made reference recently to the song Sympathy for the Devil, and there's this really interesting line in it that goes, "I made damn sure that Pilate washed his hands and sealed his fate." Now, that last part is slightly unorthodox in that there's no such thing as a guarantee that anybody is in hell. So, it's a fairly orthodox song otherwise, though, which is very, very interesting. Some people find it iffy, but it's actually really quite surprisingly orthodox in a Christian sense. So, anyhow, Pontius Pilate is an interesting figure. And he's interesting for a variety of reasons. But the one that concerns me at the moment is specifically the part about him washing his hands and why he did this. He for those who don't know, he publicly washed his hands, indicating that he is innocent of the blood of the man he was about to crucify. Now, there are some people who take this in a very wishy-washy sort of sense, that Pilate really thought that Jesus was completely innocent and was horrified by taking part in doing something so abhorrent as crucifying the Son of God and so on. But, and because some people take it this way, other people take this sort of portrayal in the Gospels to be about how Christians were trying to carry favor with the Romans and to make Christianity more palatable to the Romans. But this, I think, is a pretty bad misreading of what you actually find in the Gospels. And what I want to talk about is not theology, but human psychology. Because Pontius Pilate was interesting. Pontius Pilate was well known for being very brutal as the governor of Judea. He caused more than one insurrection by the Jews, or at least riot, when he, for what Wikipedia calls religious insensitivity, but doing things like polluting Judea with pagan symbols and so on. Quite gratuitously. Before him, people didn't do this, and he just let his soldiers carry in stuff with the pagan symbols, the Roman gods, and this really angered the Jews, and he got into all sorts of things were brutally putting them down and so on. He was a brutal man, very violent, very willing to be violent. And herein, actually, we have the key. So the question comes up of, well, why would this brutal man, care about crucifying Jesus? Why would he recoil in horror from this? And what I argue is that the picture you see in the Gospels is not of a man recoiling in horror from putting an innocent man to death. We see a very different picture. And the thing and I think the key to understanding this, and as I said, this is human psychology, is that Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of this backwards place that was a pretty bad assignment in many regards, because who wants to be in charge of the Jews, these people who the Romans actually basically at some point just said, okay, fine, you don't have to make sacrifices to the emperor, because the other alternative was just killing all of the Jews, because they just refused so categorically, and if you kill them all, they won't pay any taxes. And so the Romans kind of figured, well, okay, you're not really causing much in the way of problems otherwise, so fine, whatever. And they just kind of let them get away with it. And Pilate was not as lenient in that regard. He sort of more wanted to bring them to heel. And you see within this, these are people he looked down on. These are people he saw as unruly and below him. Now, another interesting thing, part of the psychological picture, is that one of the things of the Roman domination over Judea was that the Jews were not allowed to put people to death. That was reserved for the Romans. They could do lesser things, but execution was something the Romans had to do. And therefore it had to be for Roman reasons. Now, what you see happening is that the Jews bring Jesus here. And now, by the way, when I say the Jews, just because of some modern stuff, I'm using the language that you get within the Gospels themselves, who are written largely by Jews, by the way. So when I say the Jews, this has nothing to do with any sort of modern anti-Semitism. This is a description of what you find in the Gospels, and remembering that Jesus himself was Jewish and so on. So just to be absolutely clear, I repudiate any sort of anti-Semitism, as the Catholic Church does. So you can find various things from the popes saying exactly that. So anyway, that caveat aside. So the Jews bring Jesus here, saying that they want to crucify him. Now, it's interesting, the way it begins even, is that, here you go, they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Now, right there, so here is Pilate, the Roman governor of these people that he looked down upon as these lesser non-Romans, because remember that most of them were not Roman citizens. Some Jews were, but a lot were not. These non-Romans that he was supposed to pacify, who were very unruly and completely unreasonable and really, really weird in that world. Everybody was willing to make sacrifices to each other's pagan gods and so on. And here are the Jews, who are these just utterly set apart people. And so this group that he is in charge of, who will not do as they are told, who is making his life miserable in this unpleasant outpost, again, remember, speaking from, Pilate psychology, have come demanding that this guy be put to death. Now, it will become very, very clear very, very quickly, the reason why is because this guy is guilty of Jewish blasphemy. Now, Pilate, a Roman, is not going to care even slightly about Jewish blasphemy. So what? I mean, Pilate himself was blasphemous to the Jews, so much so he had to go outside of his building rather than have them come to him, as they should have, because they looked down on him so much. This is not a relationship of friends. This is not a relationship where Pilate wants to do anything for these people. This is a relationship where Pilate wants to subjugate them, and they are stiff-necked and won't be subjugated. And then you get different accounts where the Jews are generally canny enough to make the charge that Jesus was a political insurrectionist, because Pilate would not care even slightly about anything but that. However, this does not mean that Pilate is an idiot. And just look at the conversation between Pilate and Jesus of what happens now. Or actually, backing up very slightly, they answered, Pilate said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If the man were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." And then, I'm skipping over the theological side because I'm just talking about the psychology of Pilate. Pilate entered the praetorium again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingship is not of this world. If my kingship were of this world, my servants would fight, that I might not be handed over to the Jews. But my kingship is not from this world." Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no crime in him." Okay, now, this is not, this is where we find some people saying like, Pilate saw exactly what was going on and so on. But think of the psychology of it. Here, the Roman governor who is woken up early in the morning, or who is at least, having to deal with this early in the morning, where he has had to come outside to this rabble because they think themselves above him so much so that they won't even enter the same building as him. These people who are supposed to be his subjects, who are incredibly stiff-necked and will not do what they're supposed to, have very obviously trumped up some political charges because those are the only things that he would care about, but they are obviously wasting his time because this is very, very clearly somebody who has something to do with the Jewish theology, which doesn't matter at all to Pilate. And they want to put him to death for their, Jewish theology reasons. And so they've had to lie to Pilate to trump up political charges that are obviously false, because this is obviously not some sort of military leader. This is patently, obviously, some sort of teacher, some guy who is concerned with all that spiritual stuff that doesn't really matter very much to a successful Roman soldier. And so he is being lied to in order to get him to do the bidding of the people who are supposed to be his subjects. So remember, the power relationship is supposed to go, Pilate tells the Jews what to do, and they do it. In this case, they are trying to tell Pilate what to do. They are trying to make Pilate do their bidding. They are trying to get Pilate to be their servant. Now, Pilate does not need to be a good man to dislike the idea of the people who are supposed to be his servants trying to use him as their servant. In fact, that's going to rile him quite a lot, and part of the reason why the Jews are not allowed to put people to death is specifically so that only Roman reasons for putting people to death actually count. It's a means of subjugating them. And here they are trying to get around this fact and have Pilate do what they want by lying to Pilate. And nobody, no matter how bloodthirsty, no matter how brutal, enjoys being lied to in order to be manipulated to do somebody else's bidding that you have no interest in doing on your own. So right here you can see this brutal man who has, caused insurrections by his, unwillingness to bend to the Jews and to Jewish customs and to Jewish religious beliefs, is here trying to be, they're trying to persuade him, or, trick him really, into executing this guy for political reasons, for actually theological reasons, the stuff that Pilate has already gotten into trouble for not caring about. And so you see the interesting picture that emerges there of where Pilate doesn't want to be doing this. He does not want to put this guy to death, not because he cares about the guy, not because he cares about, what's killing one more Jew to him. He's done that plenty. He's been willing to do that plenty. So what does that part matter to him? But he's not going to want to be their puppet. He's not going to want to enforce Jewish theological law, pretending to be enforcing Roman law. He has no interest in this. He wants them to stop all this Jewish stuff and just be ordinary Romans. So there you have your very, very, very human, very low psychological motivation for why Pilate wants to get out of this. Because he wants to be the one on top, not the servant. And so you have the thing, and then, the interesting thing where he's like, well, how about this? I'll just have him scourged. And remember, scourging is a terrible thing. One really excellent thing in terms of cinematography in The Passion of the Christ, the movie by Mel Gibson, is the part where the Romans, they start off with just a beating to soften someone up with sticks, and then they switch to the scourge. And there's this interesting scene where, for those who don't know, the scourge it was a whip that had things like bits of broken pottery and glass, and I think occasionally nails and stuff, and sharp metal, and so on. It was meant to rip your skin open. It's possible and relatively easy to scourge somebody to death. People didn't always survive scourging. And so when he scourged, there's this great scene where one of the Romans, before they actually start hitting Jesus, he just takes it and he hits a table with the scourge, and one of the pieces of metal gets embedded in the table to the point where they have to yank really hard to get it out. And it's a really good portrayal of what scourging was. And so he sort of casually said, like, well, okay, how about we compromise? I'll have him scourged for you. And so eventually, the Jews are very insistent. They won't let this go, and they're going to riot unless they get what they want. And Pilate's already in trouble for having caused enough riots at this point. And if you think about it too, if Pilate is explaining like, well, the Jews just wanted me to kill a Jew, but I wouldn't, and so they, so much so they rioted, would that make any sense to any other Romans? Like, just kill one of them and let them be peaceful. We don't need more revolts. Because don't forget that a revolt is expensive to put down. You have to pay the soldiers, and soldiers get injured, and equipment gets damaged, and so on. Like, you don't want revolts when you're the Romans. It's bad for a variety of reasons. If it's at all successful, then it damages your reputation. And in any event, it's bad for trade and commerce, and get lower taxes and so on. So Pilate would not have been able to explain this very coherently to what, you wouldn't kill some Jew and that's why they revolted. So he wasn't really in a place where anyone would have backed him up in this. He just had his own personal pride in not wanting to be used at issue. There also is, interestingly too, it's mentioned in one of the Gospels, his wife actually sent him a message saying, I had a dream that upset me greatly, have nothing to do with this man. And so there's another interesting thing, because people rarely do the things they do for just one reason. It's often, a collection of threads where no one thread is enough, but several threads together end up being why they do it. And so, there's also the pleasing of his wife, the fact that at the time, people would take, auspicious and inauspicious dreams seriously. And so if his wife, who had any sort of, if she had any sort of gift of prophecy of any kind whatsoever, if she had this thing that, having to do with this guy was a bad omen of some kind, it's one more thread for why he'd want to essentially preserve his dignity in this fashion. It's not that it would be a motivating reason, but rather that it would help to provide a justification for what he wanted to do anyway for the sake of his own dignity and the sake of his pride, essentially. So there's that. And then so a final thing is he's giving in Why does he wash his hands? Now, there's the interpretation whereby he realizes that this is a horrible and deeply unjust act and wants no part of it, and he's being forced, and so he wants to distance himself as much as possible. Now, this is possible, but it doesn't, I mean, that doesn't actually work in any event. You can't do something and say, like, well, I don't want to, so I'm completely innocent, even though I'm actually doing it. It's not very successful, nor, incidentally, is it particularly flattering. On the other hand, if you think of it as essentially like, the man who is losing, and the proud man who is losing is going to have that sort of Ahab's instinct of, for hate's sake, I spit at thee, from hell's heart I stab at thee. Said as Ahab was about to die, and he threw a spear at the white whale as he was in a boat, even though he was about to die from it. But still, instead of trying to save his life, Ahab just hated the white whale so incredibly much that even as he was dying, his last act was a futile, utterly futile attempt to kill the white whale. But as you say, for hate's sake, I stab at thee. Or for hate's sake, I spit at thee, from hell's heart, I stab at thee. It's a really, I hope I'm quoting that right. Anyway, it's a really interesting line. Also quoted very well and done well by Ricardo Montalban in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, as Khan blows up his own ship to try to kill Kirk in the end, but does actually fail. And again, with the same sentiment, it's done very well. It's a really good quotation because they really get the spirit of it very well, of a man so consumed by hate that he stabs. So, in that same way, even as he's losing, he wants to do something to save face. He wants to do something to show that he's not completely at the mercy of somebody else, merely being their puppet, doing only what they say and having no agency, to use the modern term, of his own. And I think in that light, you can see Pilate as the sort of man who would ask, "What is truth?" as a sincere question, because in that the thing, for this I came into the world, and this I was born to testify to the truth, and those who are of the truth hear my voice. And Pilate's response is, "What is truth?" That's not a good man. And that's also not a man who is deeply concerned with the truth and horrified at the idea of doing something bad to an innocent man. We are talking instead about a man who is deeply cynical, a man who has been through a lot of machinations and so on, and his life is primarily about things like power. And so, applied to this, when he's forced to do what the Jews want, which is a terrible position to be in for a proud man, to be forced to do what somebody else wants you to do, even though you don't want to. And he doesn't want to because it's below him, remember. So to be forced to go low, to do something you don't want to have to do, to be forced to do what somebody else wants to do over your own wishes is a terrible thing. So in order to preserve some element of his own, he then orders a bowl of water to be brought, and he publicly washes his hands. So that, does he really care that an innocent man is dying? It seems extremely unlikely. On the other hand, saying, you are killing an innocent man, the thing you are doing is wrong, and I'm letting you get away with it, is sort of a final stab at the people he cannot control, in this case. And clearly, he is not controlling them, they're controlling him. He's doing their bidding, which is a very painful place to be in. And so he publicly washes his hands in water, saying that I am innocent of this man's blood, it is your doing. It is at least one last sort of spitting at them, saying, you suck. You are bad. It's one thing he can get away with, where they would not have wanted this. They would much rather have, the Romans take the blame in, silently do their bidding, essentially, in that sort of sense. Again, just because the modern stuff, like this idea that anti-Semitism is somehow justified because of the Jews killed Jesus, it's so unfathomably stupid, I forget most of the time that it even exists. Jesus himself was a Jew, the disciples were Jews, most of the early Christians were Jews. This is insane to such a great degree. Anyway, so, obviously there were some people, some of the Jews did this, and, some of the leaders in charge, but even there, you find leaders of the Jews who were not. The Sanhedrin, voted and so on. There were good people in it, clearly attested within the Gospels. As I said, it's so stupid, it makes no sense. Anyway, I mean, it's an excuse. I understand, historically speaking, it's an excuse. Anyway, sorry for the digression. It's just a little important given the modern context. Anyhow. Okay, so having rejected that nonsense again, the relevant thing here being, this is his last last-ditch thing to sort of spit at the people who are, at the moment, humiliating him. And I think read that way, that he's now taking the high road, that he would normally never care about and doesn't even care about here. But if this is the only thing left to you, if the only thing left to you is saying, well, you guys are being bad. I mean, no, obviously by their own lights, they wouldn't really be. I mean, if they're killing him for Jewish theological reasons, they would, themselves think themselves justified. So it's not even a very cogent, to say that, like, you are failing by Roman standards wouldn't mean very much, because obviously transgressing, Jewish blasphemy doesn't mean much to a Roman. But at the same time, it's sort of the last thing he has left as he is acquiescing and letting them. And then you can see, again, in one of those great jokes in history, when Pilate had, the sign nailed on the cross in 3 languages, saying, the Latin, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And then the Jews came to him afterward and said, change that sign, have it say rather, he said he was King of the Jews. And Pilate replied, what I have written, I have written. And, again, you see that thing where he just had that written, and it's sort of a jab at them. The fact that it says Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, was a jab at the Jews, because he did not, this is saying, like, well, here is your king, look at how pathetic you are that your king is being crucified. And it's, not that Pilate understood Jesus' actual role as an actual sort of king, if not of this world, but rather, think of this not as very high, but as very low. As in, like, okay, you wanted me to crucify him as King of the Jews, so fine, I'll actually call him your king. Which is a tremendous insult, because to insult a king is to insult the people he is the king over, because there's a relationship of subordination and kingship and being in that person's kingdom. And so to insult the king is to insult the people who are subordinate to him, because however low the king is, his subordinates are lower. And so here, this is an insult to the Jews that he nailed on top of the cross, as he had to do this for him, but he got in an insult. And then this he can get away with. They're not going to rebel over this. And so he stuck to it. Here, where he could insult them and get away with it, he did. And they said, change it instead to say he claimed to be King of the Jews, and what I have written, I have written. And he had just no more patience, because they couldn't force him here, and where they couldn't force him, he had no interest in bending whatsoever. And so, again, he stuck to it, and stuck to having this little jab at them, at least, when he couldn't do any, couldn't have his own will better, because what the heck does a, Roman soldier care about Jewish blasphemy, as I said. And I think that's the key to understanding this psychological thing. And and sort of in the broader sense, the idea that Pilate was taking sort of a high but imperfect road is just not what the picture painted in the Gospels. I mean, I've concentrated on John because that's where you get most of the actual dialogue, and brought in a few other things. But they're all consonant on this point. They have slightly different accounts of it, different perspectives, different things said, different things they leave out. But they all paint that basic picture of where Pilate was clearly presented with a man who obviously was not a political insurrectionist, who, I mean, among other things, he had no army, he had no weapons, he had no followers with weapons. They brought this guy who had already been in chains and beaten to him as somebody who was a political insurrectionist, but there was no army, there was nobody with weapons revolting. It is on its face deeply implausible that the Jews managed to discover this guy who was a threat to Roman supremacy, and the Romans had not heard of it. The Romans had seen neither, hide nor hair of any beast of war, had seen, no swords and so on in this, and yet somehow, here's this guy who's actually this important political revolutionary. It's not plausible on its face. Transparently from the very beginning, this is a matter of this guy was a Jewish blasphemer, and they wanted the Romans to carry out the Mosaic law on Jewish blasphemy, which the Romans would have no reason to do. And so when you put it all together, I think it paints a very interesting psychological picture of how is it that this thing that some people want to take as sort of a high road actually makes a lot more sense, and is a picture painted of a very low road. But you get the very odd thing that has been noted from time to time, that there are various vices that will often do the work of virtues in certain circumstances. And this happens to be one of those curious circumstances where this man with a great many vices, this brutal, proud man, happened to, in this very very unusual circumstance, look a little bit like a virtuous man, but not very much. And as I said, if you pay attention to the Gospels, I don't think the virtuous Pilate is really a supportable idea at all. I mean, you see other things too, um, uh, was it Luke, where, or maybe Matthew, where I think it was Luke, where Pilate learned that Jesus was a Galilean. He's like, screw this, and sent him to Herod instead. That is to say, he didn't want to have to deal with this, so he just fobbed him off on Herod. But also, interestingly, Herod then essentially sent Jesus back, and the two had been enemies but became friends after this, where they both sort of did acts respecting of the other one's dignity, and so that somewhat reconciled them in this case. Again, this is not the act of a virtuous man. A virtuous man would not become friends with Herod over this. So the whole thing, it just makes no sense at all if you're trying to think of it as Pilate, being virtuous, but it makes a tremendous amount of sense and paints a very, very realistic and somewhat complex psychological picture of a very vicious man in this in this particular complex circumstance, of what we know of him and so on. And it's a really weird thing that happens when people try to sort of put the best light they can on this. Very often you have to be just incredibly inconsistent with most of it, including human psychology, in order to do that, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make sense to be inconsistent with everything, both the Gospels and human psychology and so on. And so, also, not that this is my primary reason, but just as sort of a side note, that idea that the Christians did this in order to try to exculpate the Romans, actually this puts the Romans in a pretty bad light when you get down to it. I mean, saying that the Romans were essentially tricked into, or not even tricked. At first, they were trying to be tricked into doing the Jews' bidding, and then finally the Jews simply threatened the Romans into doing what they wanted. That actually doesn't paint a particularly nice picture of them. And moreover, it doesn't make sense in most of Christian psychology to think that if only these people hadn't crucified Jesus, then everything would have been fine, given that it is the crucifixion of Jesus that is the atonement for our sins. And it's mentioned multiple times, within the Gospels, and it really, really comes out in any sort of traditional, Orthodox traditional theology, that the crucifixion of Jesus was deeply necessary. And so people may have done bad, even doing something out of which good came, like the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, for example. But at the same time, it just makes no sense in Christian psychology to think that, to blame somebody for crucifying Jesus as if this was, the world would have been a much, much better place had this not happened, given that this is what God himself decided was to happen, prophesied that this was to happen, talked about how important and necessary this was over and over and over again. I mean, there's almost this drumbeat of Jesus talking about the importance of the Son of Man giving his life for the sake of many. So the idea of these people are okay because it wasn't their fault they crucified Jesus makes not even a little bit of psychological sense. Worrying about whose fault it is for crucifying Jesus makes no sense whatever to Christian psychology. I mean, to people who are very slightly Christian, I guess it kind of could, sort of, a little bit. It just, I don't know how deranged the people who actually focus on this are. They just have to be very, very deranged at sort of a minimum. Anyway, so all told, putting it all together, I kind of think it's an interesting psychological look, and largely achieved by taking human psychology, the time period, and the Gospels seriously, because they all actually paint a very consonant picture with each other. It's only when you try to take some other idea and foist it on them do you get really weird things. So, anyway, I hope that was interesting, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.